Hey, so
Hello. So I think we're about to begin. We're going to have votes in just a minute. And if the staff could bring us live to the countdown.
You're good to go at any time, ma'am.
Okay. Understanding that the ranking member is on his way and that votes will be called soon, we will begin now. The Subcommittee on Immigration and Citizenship will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. I will offer my opening statement, and as soon as Mr. Buck arrives, he will be recognized to offer his. We welcome everyone to this hearing, Immigrants as Essential Workers during COVID-19. Before we begin, I'd like to remind members that we have established an email address and distribution list dedicated to circulating exhibits, motions, or other written materials that members might want to offer as part of our hearing today. If members would like to submit materials, please send them to the email address that has been previously distributed to member offices, and we will circulate the materials to members and staff as quickly as we can. I would also remind members that guidance from the Office of the Attending Physician states that face coverings are required for all meetings in an enclosed space, such as subcommittee hearings, and members on all sides of the aisle are expected to wear a mask except when they are speaking. I'll now recognize myself for my opening statement. The COVID-19 pandemic has served as a wake-up call on a variety of social and economic issues, both globally and in the United States. The pandemic has exposed social injustices, vulnerabilities in our healthcare system, the fragility of our economy, and inequities in our education system, to name just a few. With today's hearing, we highlight another issue that has taken on new meaning in the wake of COVID-19, the fundamental role that immigrants have long played in key sectors of our economy. Since 2003, the Department of Homeland Security has identified certain industries as critical to national security, including public health, agriculture, and food processing. In the early days of the pandemic, DHS issued guidance to U.S. employers identifying certain workers as essential critical infrastructure workers. While many of us shifted to full-time telework, these workers had to continue to report in person. Each day, they risked their lives to ensure that America has a safe and plentiful domestic food supply. They care for our children, tend to the elderly, sanitize our schools and public places, and a significant portion of the essential workforce is comprised of immigrant workers. This subcommittee has held many hearings over the years to examine the important role that immigrants play in certain economic sectors. Our first hearing this Congress focused on the growing labor challenges in the agricultural sector. To anyone that attended that hearing, it should come as no surprise that farm workers were immediately identified as essential during the pandemic. Today, as wildfires rage here in California and other parts of the West Coast, agricultural work is more dangerous than ever. In addition to dealing with the threat of COVID, many farm workers must now quickly harvest at-risk crops in areas where the air is filled with ash and smoke. The COVID-19 pandemic has also exposed the essential role of immigrants in the rest of American life. Immigrant physicians, researchers, and other healthcare workers have been essential in the fight against COVID-19. Immigrants provide direct home care for more than 13 million elderly and disabled Americans, many of whom have taken ill with COVID and require even greater assistance transitioning from hospital to home. A demand for childcare services has increased by almost 250% over the past 20 years, and the void has been filled by immigrants. Today, 1/5 of the nearly 2 million early childhood educators in the United States are immigrants. As long as schools remain even partially closed, The child care shortage will continue to be a significant roadblock to a full functioning economy. Many immigrant essential workers are undocumented and live under constant threat of removal. Many others are protected by temporary programs such as the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, or the Temporary Protected Status, TPS. But they too live in fear as a result of the administration's efforts to terminate these programs. They all deserve better. Over the past year and a half, the House has passed several bills that would provide protections to immigrant essential workers. H.R. 6, the American Dream and Promise Act, would provide lawful permanent residence to Dreamers and long-term TPS recipients. In addition, reforming the H-2A visa program, H.R. 5038, the Bipartisan Farm Workforce Modernization Act, would provide legal status to thousands of farm workers. And this past May, the HEROES Act, which would provide stimulus relief to individuals and businesses and protect essential workers from removal during the pandemic. Although these workers have been identified as essential during the COVID emergency, the truth could not be plainer. They are essential now and will remain so long after the pandemic has passed, until all essential immigrant workers are protected through legal status and can easily participate in our economy and society. The United States will continue to fail to realize its full economic potential. At this point, I would like to recognize others for their opening statement. First, our ranking member, Mr. Buck, you are recognized for your opening statement.
I thank the chair, lady, and I want to start by acknowledging the important role that legal immigrants and legal refugees play in my home state of Colorado and across this country. These individuals work difficult jobs that are essential to keeping our state's economy running, including serving vital sectors like healthcare, food services, the meatpacking industry, and on farms and ranches. I also want to mention something that the chairperson brought up and addressed that issue. And I think it's important that we understand that as this country tries to regain its economic footing after this terrible disease, we have a lot of Americans who are out of work, a lot of people who have spent their lifetime paying taxes and contributing to our country that are the fabric of this country. And while we have to recognize those who are legally in this country, who are assisting in fighting this terrible disease, and I have a great deal of respect for those people who are doing that, I also think we have to recognize that illegal immigrants have no role, should not be in this country, and we are making a serious mistake when we don't allow Americans to fill jobs that are being filled now by illegal immigrants. We are doing this country a great disservice when we continue to see the unemployment rolls swell while this country actively promotes sanctuary cities in the large cities and policies that undermine the rule of law and undermine the very nature of what this country is about. The idea that Americans should stand in line for unemployment checks or welfare checks or get other forms of subsistence while those who are in this country illegally are working and undermining our economy is a sad day. And I think that this hearing should not only recognize those who are here legally, who are helping helping America and helping Americans during this very difficult time. I also think it's important that we recognize that those who are here illegally should leave, that we should take even more swift action to make sure that they leave, and that we should make sure that our southern border is secure so that we don't allow more illegal immigrants to come into this country. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Madam Chair, believe you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Thank you very much. I understand that Mr. Nadler is not yet present, but I am happy to recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Jordan, for any opening remarks he may have.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't really have any opening remarks. I just want to welcome our witnesses, in particular Ms. Navratil, and look forward to hearing her testimony. Yield back.
Very good. Then it's now my pleasure to introduce the witnesses, and here they are. Vicente Reyes is a 20-year-old farm worker, college student, and a beneficiary of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. He resides in Bakersfield, California, and since 2010, Mr. Reyes has worked alongside his parents, harvesting crops, carrots, beets, oranges, table grapes, onions, lettuce, kale, and mustard crops. He, along with his mother and father, are currently working the table grape harvest. Vicente is a second-year student at Bakersfield College and plans to attend the California Institute of Technology in the fall of 2020 to pursue a career in robotics engineering. And just as a point of personal privilege, my husband attended Bakersfield College for 2 years before he went off to UCLA, and my late father-in-law, Dr. John J. Collins, served as the president of Bakersfield College for many years. So I have a tremendous affinity for Bakersfield College. It's a wonderful institution. We have also Hae-Young Yoon, who is the Senior Director of Policy at the National Domestic Workers Alliance. She has spent her career advocating for the rights of low-wage and immigrant workers, serving as the Distinguished Iconic Fellow at Community Change and in various director-level roles at the National Employment Law Project. Ms. Yoon is an experienced litigator, having represented low-wage and immigrant workers in wage and hour litigation at the Urban Justice Center and serving as lead counsel in the civil rights case Iqbal versus Ashcroft. She's also taught law courses at the NYU School of Law and Brooklyn Law School. We also have Tom Jawitz, who is the Vice President of Immigration Policy at the Center for American Progress, where he oversees the organization's immigration-related research and advocacy efforts. Prior to this, Mr. Jawitz served as Chief Counsel for this very subcommittee and as an attorney for the ACLU's National Prison Project. He's also represented asylum seekers in judicial and administrative proceedings with the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Urban Affairs, as well as a law clerk to the Honorable Kimball Wood of the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York. And finally, we have Dimple Navratil, along with her husband, owns a retail store in Racine, Wisconsin, called Dimple's Imports. The business imports goods from a variety of countries in Asia, Africa, Europe, and Central America, but specializes in gemstone jewelry made by Ms. Navratil's family members who are silversmiths in India. Ms. Navratil is active in her community and currently sits on the board of the Racine Zoo, the Downtown Racine Corporation, and the Ascension Hospital Foundation. We welcome all of our witnesses and thank them for participating in today's hearing. And now, if you would please rise, each one of you, and raise your right hand, I will begin by swearing you in. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God?
I do.
I do.
I do. The record will reflect that each of the witnesses answered in the affirmative, and thank you. You may all be seated. And I will note that each of your written statements will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, I ask you to summarize your testimony in about 5 minutes. And to help you stay within that time frame, I don't think any of our witnesses are in the hearing room. For those testimony, there's a timer on your screen to help you keep track of time. And when you have reached your 5-minute limit, we do ask that you stop and summarize and finish so that we can get into our opportunity to ask questions. So first, Mr. Reyes, you may begin. You're recognized.
Ranking Member Buck, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Vicenta Reyes. I'm a farm worker, a student, and a member of the UFW Foundation. As a second-year student at Bakersfield College, I plan my school schedule around my work. I need the money to pay for my tuition to help my parents pay the bills. My dream is to pursue a career in robotics engineering. Although I'm a DACA holder, my parents are undocumented, and for 10 years, I have worked with them harvesting table grapes, avocados, carrots, onions, tangerines, beet, kale, lettuce, and potatoes in Kern County, California. California is the nation's leading agricultural state and home to the largest number of farm workers. My parents migrated from Mexico in 2005. In 2010, we moved to Bakersfield, California, where we began to work in the fields for the first time in our lives. I was only 12 years old when I personally learned about the brutal work and personal sacrifice that farm labor requires. Before I even finished the 8th grade, I had spent several seasons.
Madam Chair, we've lost connection. Madam Chair. Madam Chair. We're having technical difficulties. Can staff reach her? They have advised that technical staff.
behalf of the chair, we're going to recess, go vote, and then we will come back and resume this committee hearing. Thank you very much.
This is a room audio test. Testing 1, 2, 3.
And we hear you loud and clear inside of WebEx.
Okay, we hear you in the room now too.
As previously announced, we can reconvene and hear the testimony. The rule vote is ongoing. I'm wondering if our witnesses are with us.
I'm still here, Chairwoman Lofgren.
Very good. And what about Mr. Reyes? Is he here?
Yes, yes, I'm here.
Mr. Reyes, and then Mr. Jowitz, Tom. And I see Ms. Navratil is also here. So we have a number of members present, and I'm wondering if we might begin again. Mr. Reyes, there was a technical difficulty in the room, and your testimony could not be heard. So let's start over again, and we will begin with you, Mr. Reyes. If you could turn on your video and begin your testimony from the beginning, that would be perfect. Mr. Reyes, can you hear us?
Yes, yes.
If you could turn, there you are. If you could start your testimony again, it was not heard in the room because of a technical difficulty that has now been corrected. So let's start from the top.
Okay.
Mr. Reyes, you are to be heard for 5 minutes. You're welcome to give your testimony now.
Chairwoman Lofgren, Ranking Member Buck, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Vicente Reyes. I'm a farm worker, a student, and a member of the UFW Foundation. As a second-year student at Bakersfield College, I plan my school schedule around my work. I need the money to pay for my tuition and to help my parents pay the bills. My dream is to pursue a career in robotics engineering. Although I'm a DACA holder, my parents are undocumented, and for 10 years, I have worked with them harvesting table grapes, avocados, carrots, onions, tangerines, beet, kale, lettuce, and potatoes in Kern County, California. California is the nation's leading agricultural state and home to the largest number of farm workers. My parents migrated from Mexico in 2005. In 2010, we moved to Bakersfield, California, where we began to work in the fields for the first time in our lives. I was only 12 years old when I personally learned about the brutal work and personal sacrifice that farm labor requires. Before I even finished the 8th grade, I had spent several seasons harvesting onions. It was hard work. When you harvest onions, you are on the hot ground without shade for hours and moving down the rows with your hands and knees. As a child, I remember hiding when the supervisors would drive by. I wanted to help my family financially, but I feared that they would identify me as being too young and would kick me out of the field. If you're wondering why farm workers bring their children to work, it's out of economic necessity. My parents and I have not stopped working in the fields despite fearing deportation when we hear about ICE raids in agriculture. When the pandemic started, we were unable to shelter in place because we were designated as essential, critical infrastructure workers. As essential workers, we wondered, how would we get to work without being stopped or cited by the police because we're driving during the shelter-in-place orders? If the nation is relying on us to work, will employers provide us with protections and benefits if we get sick? And if our work is essential, would my parents and others be protected from detention and deportation? For my parents, this fear of deportation compels them to wake us up every morning and hug us as if it was the last day together. At work, being an essential worker has not meant that we get protections from COVID. Everything at work runs as if the pandemic doesn't exist, even though Kern County has over 30,000 cases of COVID-19 and nearly 400 people have died from the virus. No one in our family or in our crew has received masks, special instructions about workplace social distancing, or sanitation. Not once has our employer screened us for symptoms. My parents tell me that some workers who arrive at work ill are not turned away by the crew boss. I also know that many undocumented farm workers are afraid to test positive for COVID-19 because this would require them to quarantine at home without pay and without benefits to survive. I certainly don't feel like an essential employee, and the reality in the fields make us think that picking the crops is more important than protecting our lives and health. Employers know that we don't speak out because many of us are undocumented. To feed the nation, we are exposed to extreme heat, pesticides, to the risk of getting COVID-19, and more recently, to the wildfires and air that's unhealthy to breathe. We are at the core of the food supply chain, and we're also its first responders when extreme weather threatens to devastate the harvest. Without our labor, the food supply chain would collapse. My family are among the 5.5 million essential workers and the 11 million people who are undocumented and live with endless fear about our future. Farm workers and the rest of our nation's undocumented immigrants deserve a path to legalization and citizenship that recognizes the essential role that we play in this nation. The country is relying on us, and we rely on you to recognize our contributions and the many ways in which our health, lives, and well-beings are interconnected. Thank you.
Madam Chair, we can't hear you, ma'am. Madam Chair, we can't hear you.
Yes. I want to thank you, Mr. Reyes, for your testimony and for your patience in waiting while members voted. And now we will ask Ms. Yoon to give her 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you. Chairwoman Lofgren, Ranking Member Buck, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Hae-Young Yoon. I'm the Senior Policy Director at the National Domestic Workers Alliance. We represent 2.2 million domestic workers who work as nannies, home care workers, and house cleaners in private homes. Over 90% of domestic workers are women, well over half are women of color, and more than a third are immigrants. The COVID pandemic has revealed what many of us knew long before this pandemic, that our economy is powered by workers, and that essential workers span many sectors of our economy. These essential workers are largely in low-pay service jobs, overrepresented by immigrants, and disproportionately women and women of color. From farm workers like Vicente to janitors, from domestic workers to nurses, it took a pandemic for our nation to recognize their work is essential, and it always has been. While their labor makes our lives possible, essential workers have been largely invisible and undervalued. Too many essential workers are underpaid without benefits. Lack of immigration status makes undocumented workers even more vulnerable to violations of rights. Essential workers are risking their lives every day and that of their family members for us. Despite this, many immigrant essential workers and their families have been excluded from federal relief. Domestic workers have faced enormous hardship during this pandemic. While many are primary breadwinners, their pay is too low. All domestic workers typically make $12 an hour. Home care workers typically earn just over $16,000 annually. Many do not have savings to fall back on. During one Zoom meeting, one worker held up her phone to show that she had just a few cents in her bank account. Only 1 out of 5 domestic workers have employer-provided health insurance, and hardly any worker has paid leave. Thus, this pandemic has been a crisis of impossible choices for domestic workers. They have no choice but to go to work or risk eviction and the threat of having no food. For months, many workers went without PPE and did not receive an increase in pay. Take Sandra. She's been a house cleaner and a nanny for the past 20 years. She lives in New York City and takes the train to work to care for her 2 children. On the train, she covers herself as much as she can because she knows that a train is a high-risk area, but she needs to keep working to pay for rent and food. She has paid taxes all the years she's been working, but is excluded from COVID relief because she's undocumented. She also has no health insurance. Lee is a home care worker in LA. She worries about losing her job because she has no paid sick time, but she has an 85-year-old mother and children to support. If she does not work, she does not get paid, which puts them all at risk. Earlier in the spring, she was exposed to the virus at the assisted living facility where she works. Her employer did not give her PPE until after the exposure. The COVID-19 has also underscored the need to invest in the care infrastructure. Even before the pandemic, it was projected that the home care sector will need to fill 4.2 million jobs by 2026, creating more new jobs than any other occupation in our economy. By one estimate, nearly 20 million adults need long-term care, largely due to baby boomers aging. Our nation's need for care is colossal, and care workers will continue to be essential into the next decade. The work that care workers, other essential workers, and immigrant essential workers do is heroic, yet they're not treated like heroes. Treating them as heroes means transforming low-wage essential jobs into good jobs by paying higher wages and benefits and providing a path to citizenship. Lack of legal status for immigrant workers hurts all workers, because when employers exploit the lack of their legal status to abuse immigrant workers, they create a pervasive culture of fear in the workplace that chills efforts of all workers to enforce their rights and better their working conditions. For this reason, legalization of immigrant workers must be a central pillar of transforming essential workers' jobs into good jobs and to rebuild our economy out of this crisis. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you very much for that testimony, and also thank you for your patience while we voted. And I'll turn now to Tom Jawitz, a face that we have seen over the years in our subcommittee. Tom, you're welcome to give your testimony now.
Thank you, Chairwoman Lofgren, Ranking Member Buck, and members of the subcommittee. Thanks so much for inviting me to testify today. It's an honor to appear before the subcommittee for which I once worked, although I would prefer to be sitting in 2141 this afternoon. Still, I recognize that my ability to do my job from the safety of my home during this pandemic is a privilege and a luxury that many don't have. Over the past 6 months, millions of immigrants, like millions of other Americans, have continued to go to work at great personal risk to themselves and their families. Out of the estimated 7 million undocumented immigrants in the workforce, CAP estimates that 5 million, nearly 3 in 4, are doing jobs deemed essential to the nation's critical infrastructure by DHS's Cybersecurity and International Security Agency, or CISA. Hundreds of thousands today are on farms and in food processing plants, securing the nation's food supply. More than 200,000 are in healthcare occupations as doctors, nurses, and home health aides, and around that same number are working to keep healthcare settings safe and open. Undocumented immigrants are keeping grocery shelves stocked at warehouses and sanitizing businesses and public spaces. And when CISA recently recognized the essential contributions of care workers, they finally caught up to something every parent and employer has understood deeply for months, maybe years. Childcare is the backbone of the entire economy, and immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, play an outsized role in those jobs. But while the country comes to appreciate the essential work immigrants are doing during this pandemic, it's important to recognize that this work didn't just become essential. These people didn't just start doing this work, and many of these jobs didn't just become hazardous to the health and safety of workers. This is work, and these are workers who have long been essential to the functioning of this country and its economy. And their work will remain critical to the economic recovery ahead. That's why it's so important that the HEROES Act would extend financial support to all tax filers, as well as free coronavirus testing, treatment, and vaccines, regardless of immigration status. The bill's automatic extension of work authorization to DACA recipients and TPS holders is crucial, as these protections are now more vulnerable than ever. It's important to the nearly 1 million people who have DACA and TPS, and to the more than 500,000 U.S. citizen children in their households. It's also vital to the country as a whole, as more than 550,000 DACA recipients and TPS holders are serving their communities as essential workers. There are people like Doris Reina Landaverde, a member of SEIU and the National TPS Alliance, who developed coronavirus symptoms when she was asked by her employer, Harvard University, to continue cleaning buildings even as it was sending most of its students home to prevent the further spread of the virus. Of particular importance to today's hearing, the HEROES Act would also grant temporary protection from deportation and work authorization to undocumented essential workers. These HEROES Act provisions should be in any package passed for the current Congress, but the next Congress can and must do even better. It's clear the next Congress will have to enact a comprehensive national recovery package. And for this recovery to be sufficiently dynamic and durable, as well as inclusive and equitable, it must reach historically marginalized communities that have disproportionately been affected by the public health and economic crises that we are in and excluded from past recovery efforts. For undocumented immigrants who have long contributed to this country in myriad ways, including those now performing essential work as well as their families, such legislation must include a path to citizenship. The American people get this. Hart Research Associates found this summer that by a 3-to-1 margin, voters support a path to citizenship for undocumented essential workers. They support it both because they recognize that these workers stepped up for our country who need them most, and because immigrant workers who are essential in the pandemic will also be essential to rebuilding our economy. The 10.5 million undocumented immigrants in the country today have lived here for an average of 14 years. This is their home, where they are raising their families, and it's long past time we recognize them as fully woven into the fabric of American life. Legalization must be a core component of the recovery effort, also because it will strengthen the economy and expand opportunity. My written testimony cites a range of studies showing that first legalization and then citizenship will increase wages and productivity for all workers, generating both additional tax revenue and spending. And as undocumented immigrants are particularly vulnerable to wage theft and other forms of workplace abuse, legalization also will create the foundation for a strong and resilient labor market for all workers. Think back to March and April, when the country first became aware of how serious this pandemic was. At the time, there was a real sense of common purpose and shared sacrifice. People clapped during shift changes at the hospital and put up signs in their yards thanking essential workers. 6 months in, even as the number of new infections and deaths each day is so many times greater than in those early months, it's hard to feel that same sense of unity. But now we've lost more than 200,000 American lives. Our failure to check the virus has kept the economy in deep freeze. The main lesson of the pandemic, a lesson we learned, then forgot, but need to learn once more, is we can only beat it if we work together. And just as we must all work together to defeat the coronavirus, we have to all work together to rebuild the country. A national recovery package that leaves behind millions of people who have put so much on the line and have already lost so much, will come up short of what our country and its people need and deserve. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that testimony and your patience. Now we will turn to our last witness, Ms. Navratil. You are invited to give us your about 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you, Chairwoman Lofgren and Ranking Member Buck, for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Dimple Navratil. I appreciate the opportunity to tell my mostly happy immigration story. I'm originally from India, but I am now a proud citizen of the United States. I have made my home in Racine, Wisconsin, a beautiful city in the shores of Lake Michigan. I've been married to Dennis Navratil for 28 years, and together we have a grown son named Zane. Please allow our mother a moment to brag. Zane is a 3-time state champion in tennis. He was an academic All-American in college. He's an accountant and also a 5th-ranked pickleball player in the world. He's also a humble and a kind young man. We own a retail store on Main Street in Racine called Dimples. Our business has been in downtown Racine for 21 years, making us the oldest downtown merchant. We specialize in sterling silver jewelry and unique gifts from around the world. Also, we have raised roughly $1 million over the years for hospitals via jewelry fundraisers. On a personal note, I feel blessed for the opportunities available for a minority woman from a third world country. 27 years ago, I started a small business selling jewelry from a little folding table at a church festival to today, owning a large retail store in Racine. I also feel fully accepted by the community and many organizations that I now serve as a board member, including the Racine Zoo, the Downtown Racine Corporation, and the Extension Hospital Foundation. Our business has grown slowly and steadily over the years, and we expected the same this year. Then COVID hit. Our business was forced to close sadly. We had to let go of some excellent employees, a first for us. And then our hospital partners began canceling our fundraisers, which account for approximately half our sales. Suddenly, the survival of our business was at stake. Our local mayor, Corey Mason, then announced the city would award grants to small businesses negatively impacted by COVID. We applied for the relief. Though we clearly met the criteria and the city strongly indicated a desire to assist women and minority-owned businesses, we were denied both of the 2 rounds of grants that were funded through HUD and our local taxes. I did not understand why we were denied the grants. I thought that many would consider our award-winning business as an anchor in downtown, worthy of efforts to save. We pay our taxes on time. We are active in the community. We are located in the heart of a business district. Something didn't seem right. After some persistence, I received a call from the Mayor Mason. After more questioning, he told me the real reason why we were denied the grant. It was because my husband had attended the Open Wisconsin rally in Madison that challenged Governor Evers' stay-at-home order. Mayor Mason admitted as much in public statement, adding that Dennis, and I quote, willingly jeopardized public health, flagrantly violated safety measures, put city residents at unnecessary risk, and engaged in reckless behavior at the rally. But here is the truth. Dennis did attend the rally. Because he was concerned about the virus, he wore a mask. He stayed at the edge of the crowd and was careful to maintain a safe distance from others. All of this has been proven. It was there that Dennis was approached by a reporter. He had 2 simple points. First, if a liquor store or a Walmart can safely serve their customers, why can't we? Second, you can be concerned about the damage done by the virus and care about the people suffering economically. It is also important to stress the nature of this protest. Nobody was insulting or throwing objects at the police. No buildings were set on fire. No businesses were looted or destroyed. There were no arrests. This was an entirely peaceful protest. Apparently, our mayor believes he is not constrained by a constitution that I swore allegiance to and that he swore to uphold. We have decided to fight this injustice, and as such, I am grateful to live in the United States with a constitution designed to protect the rights of citizens from abusive officials. I am thankful to have the opportunity to pursue a just conclusion through an impartial judicial system. I look forward to a resolution and I trust will uphold the cherished rights of all Americans. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much for your testimony and your patience in waiting while the members voted. And we will now go to members of the subcommittee who have questions, and each member has up to 5 minutes to answer their questions. And we will first turn to the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, for questions that she may have.
Thank you, Chairwoman Lofgren, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. Ms. Navratil, I too am an Indian citizen, and I applaud your work and your business for what it has done. Thank you for testifying. More than 200,000 lives lost in America due to COVID-19 and this pandemic that has raged throughout this country, even as this president and too many around him have denied even the most basic science about mask wearing, social distancing, or PPE. 200,000 lives lost. Meanwhile, across the border in Canada, they're down to 0 deaths. And of course, essential workers have been most susceptible and most affected because they are actually helping to save us. They are essential, and yet we have treated them as expendable, not giving them the most basic protections that they need. Some have called the economic crisis that we're facing a she-cession due to the deep and disparate impact on women. Women's unemployment rate has reached double digits for the first time since 1948. The hardest hit industries leisure, hospitality, education, and even some parts of healthcare are disproportionately non-white and female. And at the same time, women who have traditionally worked outside the house are now being forced to choose between work and childcare. Domestic workers and working women have always been inextricably linked, and never more so than now. Domestic workers have given not only women, but families across the country the ability to work outside the home. So let me start with you, Ms. Yoon. How has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted domestic workers specifically and the people who depend on them?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. So as soon as the shelter-in-place orders went into effect in March, we started a weekly survey of our workers to understand how the pandemic was affecting them and their families. In early April, we found that 72% of survey workers, a lion's share of them being nannies and house cleaners, suddenly lost their jobs, while home care workers were overwhelmingly continuing to go to work to care for an elderly or person with disabilities. The survey also confirmed that 77% of workers are primary breadwinners. So with the sudden loss of income, domestic workers quickly started to experience food and housing insecurity. In early April, 84% reported that they were uncertain whether they would have enough money to buy food in the following week. 55% were unable to pay rent. Housing and food insecurity has been one of the most pressing concerns for domestic workers throughout the pandemic. In our more recent survey in September, 56% still reported that they could not pay rent or mortgage. Since April, we have seen workers slowly regaining their jobs, but they're working less hours, which means they're earning less. Domestic workers were experiencing financial insecurity even before the pandemic, and during this crisis, the hardship they're experiencing is unspeakable. I want to close with this one data because that has been most disconcerting for all of us at the National Domestic Workers Alliance is that domestic workers that we've been surveying, that 80% of those who are working earned at most $300 per week since the lockdown, right? So that's $300 at most, $1,200 a month. That is not a wage that can sustain a worker and their families.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question. I'm going to ask you to be really brief because I want to get to Mr. Jowitz as well. For domestic workers who are able to continue working, what safety precautions exist to ensure that they're able to work safely?
So I think earlier on, no one had any PPE, right? There were really domestic workers already navigating the reality of being legally excluded from basic workplace protections like health and safety, and not having critical workplace benefits like health insurance and paid leave. And the pandemic really thrusted on them a lot more to navigate on their own, to protect themselves and protect their clients, right? Without the assistance from the government. So early on, we heard.
Thank you. I just want to make sure I get in a question I have for Mr. Jowitz as well before my time expires. Mr. Jowitz, the vast majority of domestic workers are immigrant women. Would these immigrant women qualify for the economic relief under the CARES Act? And how do we ensure that they get that relief and also that they're acknowledged for the critical role they play?
Thanks so much, Congresswoman. I mean, obviously, really look at the different provisions in the bill by different populations, but by and large, especially looking at undocumented immigrants who are serving these rules, they're carved out as some of the most important and most quickly understood benefits, right? So if you're looking at the direct stimulus checks, for instance, not only were undocumented immigrants across the board carved out from that, but even U.S. citizens who were in the families of those individuals were carved out, including U.S. citizen children. If you look, for instance, at all the unemployment insurance that was expanded, again, that's going to carve out undocumented workers. In terms of emergency medical care relief, for the provisions that provided direct care access for coronavirus testing and treatment and related services, emergency services weren't necessarily affected, but the provisions that expanded access to ensure everyone had access to care, those were carved out as well.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jowitz. I yield back.
And I'm pleased now to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Buck.
I thank the chair lady, and I would like to yield to Ms. Lesko and then be recognized later if that is acceptable.
That's totally acceptable. Ms. Lesko, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you for all of you testifying today. Ms. Navratil, I have some questions for you. In your testimony, you said, our local mayor, Corey Mason, announced that the city would award grants to small businesses negatively impacted by COVID. We applied for the relief. They were clearly, though we clearly met the criteria and the city strongly indicated a desire to assist women and minority-owned businesses, we were denied both of the 2 rounds of grants that were funded through HUD and our local taxes. And then in your testimony later, you said when you spoke to him in person, he admitted that the reason he did it was because your husband attended a rally or whatever you want to call it, a protest in Madison to open up back businesses. And so, which I find very offensive and obviously not right. Are you aware, is your husband and you and the mayor from different political parties? You have to unmute.
Sorry. Yes, as my husband has been vocally conservative on local issues.
Thank you. And were there protests and riots in Racine, Wisconsin, and the surrounding areas after the George Floyd killing?
Yes, there were protests and limited rioting. A community-oriented policing house was set on fire. And to the best of my knowledge, there was not an enforcement of social distancing and nobody was punished or cited for it.
And what was the mayor's reaction to those protests and riots? Did he approve of them? Did he sign off on them? Did he say anything about them?
From what I believe is that he allowed the protests and riots to go on for 2 days and continued for 2 weeks. Our city was on the edge, expecting to get worse again.
So basically the mayor said you guys weren't in compliance because supposedly your husband went to this protest and was not in compliance and affected the community in some way. Yet you testified that your husband had on a mask, was on the outskirts of the people, and the mayor had a totally different set of rules for these protesters. Is that my understanding?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, I find that outrageous, and I'm glad that you're pursuing it. I would assume that these grants probably came from some type of federal money, and so I'm glad that you're here testifying today, and I hope that you are successful, and I applaud you for stepping forward. Hopefully you don't get rioters and protesters now at your house, like is being threatened in some other areas and with Congress members. Now I have about a minute left, and I have some questions for Mr. Jawitz. Mr. Jawitz, in your testimony, you advocate for legislation to provide legal immigration status to the nation's illegal immigrant population. Do you support precluding aliens who have DUI convictions from benefiting from this legalization?
I mean, I think well, for starters, I'm going to say, thanks for the question. If we look at the legalizations that have been done in the past and proposed in the past, you've seen different eligibility criteria that have been created. Last year, we worked very closely on the House HR 6 bill that would provide a path to legal status for Dreamers and TPS holders. That bill was, very, very well negotiated, passed with strong bipartisan support in the past, and it certainly did have, eligibility criteria in it. Whether you would look at a single DUI as being something to disqualify someone, I think even when I was on the committee, frankly, we looked at that issue, and I think there were a number of members of the committee itself, frankly, who wouldn't have passed that test. And so anytime I think you're looking at what the qualifications should be for eligibility for a program. We need to do that in connection with kind of the totality of the circumstances, the person as a whole. Think about that in terms of what the criminal justice system more broadly looks like. And I think that's where you apply that criteria.
So I think your answer is yes, depending on the circumstances. If they did have a DUI conviction, they should benefit from legalization, is what I think your answer said. So I yield back. My time is up.
Gentlelady's time has expired. A third vote has been called on the floor, but it will take some time. So I think let's go through some members, especially the members that are in the room as opposed to participating virtually. And perhaps as they are called on, they can go vote and come back. The gentleman from California, Mr. Correa, is recognized.
Thank you, Chairperson Lofgren, for holding this most important hearing. And again, here we are again debating the role of immigrants in our society and in our nation, this time, of course, in the context of COVID-19. We keep hearing the same story I've heard for decades, which is that these jobs should be done by Americans. Yet a few months ago, I got a phone call from a representative of the poultry industry. That was prompted by the immigration, the ICE raids in the poultry plants in the Deep South. And the representative said, look, Lou, this is not about salaries. All these workers are members of the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. They make good money. The problem is no locals want to take these jobs. As a result, those industries, those economies as well, were brought to a standstill. A few months later, I visited a local farm here in my district to essentially distribute protective equipment and gear to local farm workers. Those farm workers, I can tell you, were also undocumented. And I can also tell you they wanted nothing to do with us because they wanted to do their job, stay away from society, stay away from the authorities, and move on. And then, of course, just a few months ago, I remember walking into our local supermarkets, empty shelves, no foods. And for the first time in my life in America, I have to say, I was concerned that there wasn't going to be enough food for us. We tried not to panic, and we didn't. But the point is clear. These workers are essential workers. They are feeding America, from the farms to the poultry plants to, of course, our hospitals. Those essential workers, those nurses are taking care of us. So I find it interesting that we are talking again about illegal individuals as opposed to our frontline workers in the fight against COVID. If I may, in the 2 minutes, 3 minutes that I have, I want to ask our witnesses a question. If I can have each one of you answer it briefly. Is there a pathway to citizenship? Is there a pathway for one of these workers to get a work permit in this country today? Vicente. Is there a legal pathway for your mom and dad to get a work permit so they continue to work in the fields to feed our society? Yes or no?
I don't have the answer right now. But
Ms.
I will
Yoon,
get back to you.
can you answer that question, Ms. Yoon?
Yes, for many of the domestic workers, care workers, vast majority of people who've been in our country and working in our economy for decades do not have a real path to gain legal status and citizenship.
Ms. Defartil, is there a pathway for these individuals? Or would you know, yes or no?
Are you asking me, sir?
Yes, go ahead. Would you
So
know if there's a
I'm not-
pathway for these essential workers to get a work permit in the U.S.?
Well, I'm not an expert in that.
Thank you
because
very
I'm
much. In the minute
Thank you.
I have, Mr. Jarowitz, there was a question earlier about a DUI. And I think this is an issue really talking about judicial discretion. You have judges that make decisions whether you should stay in this country or not. And I'm reminded of the story of our veterans with green cards that are deported because there is no judicial discretion in our immigration system. You have these immigrants with green cards that go off and fight for our country. Then they return, then they do something that's dumb, or because of their mental scars, they do something and then they're convicted and they're deported. Sir, how important is judicial discretion when it comes to immigration and the application of immigration law?
Yeah, so discretion is absolutely essential to any judicial system, and it's the underpinning of a due process and sort of a fundamental fairness in the system. And in our immigration system, as you pointed out, you can have someone who has a green card who's deported for a crime they may have been convicted of 20, 30 years earlier that wasn't even a deportable offense when they were convicted of it, and the judge has nothing they can really do.
And I have to
that
tell
needs
you
to change in
that
our system.
I agree with you, and it just breaks my heart to know that there are colonies of American veterans that are living outside this country in the Philippines and Mexico that because of an infraction, they can return to the United States to be buried at a national cemetery, but they can't get a green card to live in the U.S. Madam Chair, I'm out of time, I yield. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The ranking member, Mr. Buck, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I appreciate the gentleman from California talking about legal status. Ms. Navratil, you undoubtedly have a great perspective on legal status in this country. Where were you born?
I was born in India, sir.
And how did you obtain legal status in this country?
I fell in love with an American citizen.
You did. And how did that happen?
I don't know how to explain that.
Okay. Let me ask you about your situation with your husband. Is he, I take it he didn't burn down an Arby's restaurant in Racine?
No, sir.
Did he spray paint any rude language on public buildings in Racine, maybe like City Hall?
No, absolutely not.
And how about, did he taunt police officers or in any way demeaning to public servants?
No, sir.
So in other words, your husband followed the law, obeyed the law, and exercised his First Amendment rights to protest, to express his opinion, to question authority. I always see when I drive by or anywhere close to Boulder, Colorado, I see bumper stickers that say question authority. I think that's an American right and sometimes an obligation in this country. And your husband did just that, didn't he?
Absolutely, sir.
So he questioned authority, and the result was that he was discriminated against.
Correct.
How does that make you feel as a woman of color? How does it make you feel that for being an American, for exercising your constitutional rights, you are discriminated against?
Well, we were very upset and sad. We considered leaving the city. We considered selling a building and moving out. But after thinking through it all, we decided that we were going to fight this injustice. We have the support of all the local citizens, our customers, our friends over here. And I don't think we can leave that easy. We're going to fight.
Do you remember the oath you took when you became a naturalized citizen?
Yes.
That you would support and defend the Constitution? Do you remember that part of the oath?
Yes, sir. And I went through it again.
Yeah, and do you feel like you are supporting the Constitution by making your case heard around the country?
Absolutely. It was very, very difficult decision to make, but we couldn't be quiet about this. And I wanted to make sure nobody else went through the same as we were.
Oh, I'm afraid you're going to be joined by many other conservatives. Anybody who questions authority in a town that's run by liberal socialists are going to be discriminated against. You can guarantee that. And you might want to make sure that you prepare them and you let them know that if they contact the Republican staff at the United States House Judiciary Committee, we will be glad to help them get their voices heard. Would you help us in that?
Absolutely. That's why I'm here, to encourage people like me to be able to speak out and not be afraid.
Okay.
And thank you for the support.
And the question earlier about pathways to legal status, are you aware that if someone is in this country illegally They can leave the country, they can go back to their country of origin, and they can go to their U.S. consulate, and they can apply for legal status to become, to get some type of visa to come into this country legally. Are you aware of that process?
All the process needs to be done legally. That's
Sure.
the right way to do it.
And you sacrificed to become a U.S. citizen. You went through some hard times to become a U.S. citizen, didn't you?
Well, to go through the proper channel, you have to.
Sure. And what do you think about the fairness of people who don't sacrifice, who cheat, who break the law, who come into this country and flagrantly decide that they don't need to play by the rules, that they can just have the benefits that they enjoy in this country, while other people are waiting in line trying to do the right thing?
I don't think that's fair.
Okay. I yield back, and I thank the lady for her time in this hearing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Gentleman, ranking member yields back. We now will turn to Ms. Garcia, gentlelady from Texas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for convening this very critical subcommittee hearing to highlight the vital economic role that immigrants serve in our country, especially amidst COVID-19 pandemic. And I thank all our witnesses for their powerful testimony today by sharing their personal stories. The COVID-19 pandemic has laid to bear the fundamental role that immigrants have long played in key sectors of our economy. According to the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, prior to COVID-19 outbreak and the economic recession that has followed, immigrants comprised 17% of the U.S. labor force. Now, as the United States exceeds over 200,000 deaths, many such workers are still at risk of their lives and the well-being of their families as they report to work in critical sectors. While we've addressed the critical needs of our vulnerable communities when the HEROES Act was passed by the House in May, the Senate continues to blatantly stonewall the needs of the American people. This is unacceptable. As we heard from Mr. Reyes, these essential workers are indispensable to a safe and plentiful domestic food supply. As we heard from Ms. Yoon, these essential workers also clean and sanitize spaces for care for our children, tend to the elderly, and play an increasingly large role in agriculture and bear the responsibility of taking care of our loved ones. And as we heard from Mr. Jawitz, the ability to be able to work from home amid the pandemic is, quite frankly, a privilege that many of us have, and in fact, for some of us, it's even a luxury. Yet, this is not true for many of these people. You can't do the work of agriculture work from home. You can't care for someone from your home. You can't clean houses from your home. Take, for example, Bertha Chan, who has 2 jobs, with one being as a janitor at the Pennzoil building in downtown Houston. She cleans offices on 4 floors in the span of 4 hours and does not bring home enough money from this job for her family. Adding to the pressure, Bertha has been doing this with minimal protection as she is not provided masks and worries about the quality of the gloves that she is given. Bertha is an immigrant on the front lines of this pandemic to ensure that there are clean, sanitized offices for workers to go back to, but she worries about her well-being and her ability to provide for her family. Another example is Gloribel Gutierrez, who moved to the United States 27 years ago from El Salvador in search for a better life in this country. She works as a wheelchair attendant at the Houston airport and believes that all humans are deserving of having the same resources and treatment regardless of their immigration status. She feels especially strong about this because migrant workers have been at the forefront of this pandemic, helping to keep the country running during these tough economic and hard healthcare crises. And these are just about a few examples, but these examples could be so many other immigrants across America. So I want to start with you, Mr. Reyes, and first let me say that I pick cotton myself. I've worked on the farm, and I had a friend that we would compare notes, and she told me it was worse for her because she picked onions, you could never get rid of the smell. So I hope that that has not happened to you, because I know you said you picked onions. And thank you for picking avocados. I've always said that if I'm deserting an island and I could get one piece of fruit or vegetable, it would certainly be an avocado. So thank you for doing that, because certainly the food you put on the table is important to all Americans. But I was frankly just shocked to hear you tell me that there is absolutely no protective gear given to any of your family or any of the workers around you. Is that true, sir? And can you tell me what you can do just protect yourselves?
Yes, there is no gear that's given. All that we try to do on our part is we take either cloths, shirts, any bandanas, things that we have at our house, and we use that to protect ourselves the most that we can. But there is no gear that's being given to the farm workers.
So what if one of you does start getting sick? I mean, some of the symptoms, the high fevers, the nausea, the chills, what happens then?
We would, if we don't go to work and have to attend the doctor or stay at home, we would either just have to ride the wave and try to ration out our food and try to minimize waste of money to be able to stay aboard and stay for the whole month or more needed if we can't go to work. But if we can, we will try to go to work and protect ourselves and protect others, so that we can be producing the food that we all eat.
Well, I think it's shameful that you don't get the things that you need. And Madam Chair, I know I'm out of time. I yield back. Thank you.
Yes, and I am saying that we have just 8 members left to vote on the floor on this third vote. So members who need to go to the floor to vote should go now, and we will get you when you come back. Mr. Biggs, if you have already voted, would be happy to recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've already voted.
All right, you are recognized.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So, Ms. Navratil, can you please tell us a little bit about the naturalization process that you went through?
Exactly. What would you like to know, sir?
How long did it take, the process? What did you endure?
At that time, it was such a long time ago. Like I said, I've been here in this country 28 years ago, and I've been a naturalized citizen for 16 or 17 years. And at that time, I went through the proper channels. I submitted my paper. I had a green card first, and I had to go through my tests.
How long did it take to go through the process, if you recall?
Oh my goodness, it's been such a long time, but I think maybe a year altogether.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. And you run a business in Racine called Dimples. And how long have you been doing that business?
I've been in business for about 27 years, but I've been downtown Racine for 21 years.
And how did the COVID virus and the lockdowns and the public response, as well as the government response to that, impact your business?
Well, first of all, it dropped our sales 100%. And after the lockdown lifted, we are back. But like I said, majority of our business, we do fundraisers at hospitals. We are for profit, but we give a part of our sales to the hospitals for various fundraisers. All of them have been canceled. We do hospital fundraisers in 4 different states, and so far none have called us back, and we don't know when we will be able to get back. And
so the grants that were offered to others would have been very helpful to you, I'm sure, as you've testified previously.
Extremely, sir. In my 28 years in this country, We worked very hard to be where we are, and we have never had a handout. And this was the first time I applied for a grant and we were denied.
And
This would have helped us tremendously.
I can't help but express some dismay and some certain degree of outrage when the mayor is quoted as saying in a statement that was his duty to protect the public health of our city's residents. While I certainly support the rights of free speech and assembly, it cannot in good conscience send scarce city resources to a person or business that willingly jeopardize public health. And yet, he's referring to your husband, who was on the edge of a crowd at a rally that was peaceful, and he wore a mask the whole time. That is, I find, pretty weak sauce as a reason to deny the grant and to punish you for your husband's participation in a peaceful protest where he was actually observing the health and needs of other members of the society. That's pretty outrageous conduct on the part of the Racine mayor. And I would just, I'm going to close my comments by just noting that people who work in this country legally are appreciated, but that work does not excuse past noncompliance with U.S. immigration law, nor does it doesn't obviate a path to U.S. citizenship. We respect those who are working legally in the United States. And so many things that are going on in this country would be resolved if we would open our economy back up while taking appropriate safety precautions. That will allow the economy to flourish once again, and laid off workers can be rehired. It would actually increase wages again. And if you recall, the median income in this country is now, or excuse me, pre-COVID was $68,000. At the same time, EU is below 40. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, have you already voted? If so, we will go to Ms. Mercasile Powell. If not, we would recognize you now. Ms. Jackson Lee. Let's go to Ms. Mercasile Powell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Regrouping the focus of our hearing today, we are here to discuss the immigrants that are essential to keeping our country working during this pandemic. And I have to say just one quick response to Representative Buck here that started with, talking about undocumented immigrants. I think immigrants have been living here for tens of years, for decades, have been waiting for a legal path to citizenship, including our dreamers. So I would invite Representative Buck to join all of us to asking the Senate to pass that dreamer bill so that actually the dreamers that have been living here for years, who are essential workers, can actually have a legal status, because I agree with you. So we know that immigrant workers are the healthcare workers that are treating COVID patients. They are farm workers that are putting food on our table. They're teachers that are keeping our children learning while they're at home. Maintenance, sanitation workers that keep our cities livable and clean, and so many others that are critical to our infrastructure. In my state here in Florida, immigrants make up nearly 30% of our food sector workforce. And in the middle of this pandemic, 300,000 immigrants in Florida work in the healthcare industry. Florida and our country rely on these essential workers, and the reality is that many do not have legal status because the immigration system makes it impossible for them to have legal status. We've had multiple hearings about this. They don't want to just be here without papers. They want the papers, but the administration under this president is making it almost impossible. They're not processing asylum requests. They're denying TPS, denying passing the DACA bill. An estimated 11,600 healthcare workers in the nation right now hold TPS status, 29,000 DACA recipients. In Florida, DACA recipients contribute to the economy and over 6,300 jobs that are considered essential, including 1,100 healthcare positions. These immigrants are people that are working right now to save lives. They're keeping our nation operating during a pandemic. People like Camila, who is here in my district, in Florida's 26th district. She's a DACA recipient. She came to the US with her family when she was 3. She grew up in Miami, and she's now about 22, graduated from FIU and works as a medical assistant at Memorial West Hospital. And she's working at a COVID testing station where she takes those nasal swab samples. So you can imagine people like Camila are in the front lines of the pandemic, and they're risking their lives to keep our country going. But instead of working to protect Camila and keep her here in her country, because she's just as American as you, Mr. Buck, and everyone else, the Trump administration is trying to dismantle DACA, terminate TPS for hundreds of thousands of immigrants, including Haitians, Salvadorians, Nicaraguans, and so many others that live here in my district. We've already lost 200,000 lives because of this pandemic. And we owe it to every American to keep our essential workforce at levels that are able to handle the virus. We owe it to Camila and to countless of others who contribute in the fight against COVID to provide those protections and provide an opportunity to live and work in our community. So, Mr. Jowetz, you discussed that, and we know that we have about 550,000 DACA recipients and TPS holders who are constantly under threat by the Department of Homeland Security. What would be the impact on our ability to fight this pandemic if these workers were removed from our country or didn't have those work permits to continue working here in the United States?
Thanks so much for the question, Congresswoman. Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. I mean, we're not here talking about adding additional folks to the workforce, and there are tens of millions of Americans out of work. These are people who are currently contributing. They have been contributing for many, many years. And if you think about what it would look like to take hundreds of thousands of workers out of the workforce playing this essential role, the amount of turnover cost that businesses would encounter, the amount of disruption to their ability to provide services, especially when they're trying to make ends meet in the first place. The ways in which it would essentially disrupt, obviously, their ability to provide for their families. It'd be massively disruptive to the U.S. economy and to so many of these places. You've got tens of thousands of DACA recipients right now who are serving in healthcare occupations, same as in TPS. And when you look at what the American Association of Medical Colleges said in their brief to the Supreme Court, they said there have been years and millions of dollars of investment by medical colleges in these individuals who are going to help close the doctor shortage gap that we can anticipate in this country going forward. So they're playing an important role. Taking them out of the economy makes absolutely no sense, and certainly doesn't make us feel like the system is working any more fairly or humanely.
Yeah, and Mr. Jowetz, why is it so important then to have these essential workers work here freely without having that threat that they may be deported? Like Vicente was just mentioning, that his father hugs him in the morning like if it could be the last time that they're together.
There are a lot of reasons for that. So one of the things that study after study has found is that when individuals who are undocumented get work authorization, and then when they get citizenship, they do a lot of different things. First of all, when they have work authorization, they can get jobs that are better matches to their skills, since they're not locked into a particular job and a particular employer. Second of all, so we get additional productivity from them. Also, with that additional confidence and security in their future, they invest in themselves and their communities better, right? So we've seen this with DACA, that when individuals got the ability to stay here and got some protection from deportation and work authorization, they went to school more. They got better jobs that paid better. They put back into the community more fully. They're buying houses. They're buying cars. They're already part of our country, but they have the ability to more fully invest in their communities and in their families.
Thank you. And I think we have to make it clear that this is not, these essential workers are not taking jobs away from our American workers that are here, that we also have to provide opportunities for them. It's not an either or question. We can do both. And Ms. Navratil, a quick question for you as I was listening to you trying to remember when you got your papers. Do you remember who was president at the time?
Yes, ma'am. It was President Bush.
Okay, so we've had Republican presidents that provide that path. I'm glad to hear that it only took you a year. I can't tell you how many people in my district have been waiting for years to become citizens, even when they've been married to Americans, American-born citizens. So welcome. And I'm sorry to hear that you've had such a difficult time. we support people like you, small business owners like you, regardless of political affiliations. I don't know why we have to politicize everything in this committee when we're talking about immigration. So I'm glad that it took a year, and I would hope the same for all the immigrants that are asking and waiting for legal status here in this incredible country. Thank you.
Gentlelady's time has expired. I would turn to the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Two immediate thoughts come to mind from this hearing. The first is that if there are many in the majority party who don't care enough about this issue to even show up, but simply are content with phoning it in, how seriously any of us should take it. But I do take it seriously, which brings me to my second point. How tone deaf can you be? Here we are in the middle of the most self-destructive panic in history, when millions of people have lost their jobs because of government edicts forbidding them to work, resulting in massive unemployment, and the majority holds a hearing regarding foreign workers at a time of we are facing a shrinking pool of jobs that Americans desperately need to recover from this government-ordered lockdown. I'm simply left with an inexpressible sense of disbelief. These lockdowns haven't saved lives. We can see that plainly by comparing jurisdictions that locked down with those that didn't. Lockdowns have produced overall higher mortality rates and much higher unemployment rates than those jurisdictions that didn't panic, that stayed open, that coped and carried on. Just 8 months ago, we were enjoying the greatest economic recovery in our lifetimes. Unemployment was at its lowest point in 50 years. Unemployment for African Americans, Latino Americans, and women was the lowest ever recorded. Median income was rising for the first time in a decade, and especially for blue-collar working-class Americans. Unlike the Obama years, when people were leaving the workforce by the millions, in the Trump years, they were re-entering the workforce by the millions. And this didn't happen by accident. It happened because this administration produced one of the biggest tax cuts in American history and the biggest regulatory relief in American history. It turns out when you get out of people's pockets and out of their faces, they can succeed and prosper. Now, the left loves to talk about essential jobs. Well, let me remind them that if a job is putting food on your table and it's putting a roof over your family and is allowing you and your family to get ahead, that job is absolutely essential. And to call such jobs non-essential and such workers as non-essential is the very height of leftist, elitist philosophy. All of the progress that we made was swept away, and yet the one constant theme of the left is to destroy the jobs of American workers, while in this hearing they're elevating those who have entered our country illegally. And don't tell me there are jobs Americans aren't willing to do. The question is what employers are willing to pay, and they don't have to pay a lot if we're pushing American workers aside and replacing them with illegal immigration. Now, I missed Ms. Navratel's testimony, but I have heard it is a warning that every American needs to hear, and it bears repeating. Ms. Navratil, you obeyed all of our laws. You came to America with a sincere desire to become an American, to see your children succeed and prosper as Americans. You did everything our country asked of you to do. You obeyed our laws. You respected our sovereignty. And now you're watching millions of illegal immigrants cut in front of you. I'd like to for a moment, have you reprise the encounter that brought you to this committee today, because I'm told it is a warning that we all need to hear.
Well, I'm in front of the committee because of the injustice that was done by our Racine mayor. We have worked very hard to be where we are. And like I said earlier, we didn't take handout. We had jobs. We started a business. I started with a small table in front of a church selling jewelry. 28 years later, we have a store. We pay our taxes on time. We give back a lot to the community. I'm very involved with the community, and we've never asked for any kind of handouts. So when the mayor denied our grants, It was a slap to our face. And now it's not about the money issue at all. It's about the injustice that was done over here and our First Amendment right that was taken away from us.
And the reason was because your husband had exercised his constitutional right of free speech and freedom to peaceably assemble.
Yes, sir, exactly.
Well, thank you again for telling your story. I think we need to be aware that that is the future of every one of us in this dystopian world that we'll live in if these leftists ever seize control of our government. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Neguse, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Chairwoman Lofgren, for holding this critical hearing on immigrants on the front lines of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I want to thank you for your leadership. Immigrants are part of our communities. They are our family members, our neighbors, our colleagues, our friends, and they are overrepresented in nearly every job that has been deemed essential during the pandemic. While the Trump administration closed its borders to new immigrants, millions of immigrants already here continued to work to stop the spread and lessen the virus's impact on our economy. To my friends on the other side of the aisle who apparently are indignant at the notion that these immigrants are part of the American fabric of our country, I would say that they are working as medical and healthcare workers caring for COVID-19 patients, putting their and their families' health and safety at risk. They are our farm workers, grocery store workers, meat plant workers, and those in delivery, shipping, and trucking who are continuing to go into work each and every day to keep Americans fed. And we should honor their contributions to our society. Colorado, the great state that I have the honor of representing, is of course no different. Our immigrant and refugee communities have played an instrumental role on the front lines of this pandemic as healthcare workers, engineers, educators, small business owners, and essential workers in our food supply chain. One such person who I'd like to mention is Ashwani Adai, a manufacturing engineer who works in an international company with an office in my district in Boulder that has a number of product lines used by the world's largest pharmaceutical companies, some of which are working on COVID-19 vaccines. His H-1B petition was denied earlier this summer until my office intervened and his appeal was granted. But the loss of him would have resulted in a less successful production of those critical product lines and could have hindered the development of COVID-19 vaccines. I want to talk a bit about the DACA recipients, and Ms. Muscarell-Powell articulated, in my view, the central vexing problem that faces us as a country. Because no matter the industry, in Colorado, DACA recipients have been stepping up and contributing at a time when America needs them most. They are doing so regardless of the Trump administration's ongoing efforts to end the program. So I'd like to ask you, Ms. Yon, what would be the consequences, in your view, if the many DACA recipients who are, for example, providing childcare or those caring for elderly, sick, and disabled Americans lost their protections literally in the middle of a pandemic?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. I think my co-panelist Tom talked about this, right? That DACA recipients are part of our community, just as you said, right? The loss of work authorization would mean a few different things. One is the threat of being removed from this country and being separated from their families, from their communities, being part of this economy. It would be really devastating and unspeakable hardship that I think not just that DACA recipient, but all their families, their communities, right? And so I want to just kind of bring this conversation back to, for all intent purposes, they're Americans, right? Other than a piece of paper. And so we should remember that they've been part of our community, our economy all along. They've always been part of our community.
Thank you. Ms. Navratil, I just want to clarify one thing, and I thank you for testifying today, and thank you to all the witnesses for testifying. I want to make sure it's not your testimony today that you believe that the DACA recipients who are working in these various different industries should be deported. Is that not? That's not your testimony.
That's not my testimony.
Okay, thank you. Well, I appreciate, again, your testimony today and each of the witnesses, and I just want to make sure that that I clarified that for the record, because as Ms. Yoon articulated, and I certainly concur in her assessment, these individuals, the DACA recipients who work in our communities, who are caring for the elderly, who are working in our grocery stores, who are on the front lines of fighting for us in this pandemic, they are Americans. They're just as American as every single member of this committee. I, like some of my colleagues, I'm the son of immigrants. My parents came to this country as refugees 40 years ago, and I'm very grateful for the opportunities and the freedoms that this country has been able to offer me and my family. And I just hope that we can recognize the contributions that immigrants are making each and every day in communities across the country. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time, Madam Chair.
The gentleman yields back. I turn now to the gentle lady from Texas, Ms. Escobar, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And it is unfortunate that there's not a single Republican colleague who chose to wait and stay to the end of this hearing, because I was hoping that they would hear my comments. You know, this hearing today is about essential workers. It's not about PPP. It's not about civil unrest. It's not about grievances against immigrants. It's about essential workers. And the fact of the matter is that immigrants comprise a key component of our essential workforce. In agriculture, they make up 73% of that workforce. 29% of manufacturing, 28% of healthcare, 24% of healthcare, 28% of healthcare, 20% of logistics, 12% of education. I have a question for Ms. Navratil. If you were in need of food or healthcare, would it matter to you that the individual helping feed you or get you better, would it matter to you whether that person is undocumented or not?
No.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate that response. You know, Mr. Reyes, your testimony was extremely compelling, and I was hoping that there would be at least one Republican colleague who would wait to the very end of this hearing, because you described what it's like to work in the fields alongside undocumented immigrants, back-breaking labor. You described being on your hands and knees, picking those onions so that the rest of us would have food on our table. What is it like for you to hear a member of Congress, a member of this committee, actually more than one, say that what you're doing is taking jobs away from Americans and that you should go back? And to hear one of our panelists say that it's not fair that you're here. How does that make you feel, Mr. Reyes?
Thank you, Congresswoman Escobar.
Yes.
I feel sad because we are the ones who bring the food to every one of you every day, every week, and weekends as well. And I think it's very unfair that that's been said, because if we're taking away jobs, then why doesn't the government put homeless people who are able to work and are American, why don't they put them to work instead? And if we are taking away jobs, then why don't they do that?
Thank you, Mr. Reyes. I have to share with the members of the subcommittee and our panelists that I have met with farmers who, this is the pre-COVID, of course, but when I met with them, and this was during President Trump's talks about shutting down the border, met with me, and they said that they urgently needed help to make sure that the president didn't shut down the border, because it would essentially shut down our ability to provide food, their ability to provide food for the American public. And when I inquired about their workforce, they all acknowledged that they depend on undocumented labor, and they acknowledged that even when they have raised wages, they have not been able to secure American applicants for these jobs. So the idea that, that immigrant labor is taking jobs from Americans, while possibly true in some sectors, is absolutely not true across the board. We have to do more for our essential workforce. We should be thanking them. They should be receiving hazard pay. They should be receiving health care. They should be receiving every protection under the sun so that we can continue to enjoy the food that we have the privilege of enjoying, the health care that those of us are lucky enough to receive, and all of the other benefits that we are able to enjoy because of their backbreaking work and because they are risking their lives for us every single day. And in fact, if we're going to talk about fairness, that is what is unfair, that they don't have access to those protections. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Again, sorry for the interruption. I meant to say jobless, not homeless.
Okay, that has been noted for the record. We now go to the other lady from Texas, Ms. Sheila Jackson Lee.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for holding this important hearing that you're now holding. And let me express my appreciation to the witnesses who have provided us testimony for this matter. Let me ask the question to Mr. Reyes. Thank you so very much, and I know how hard it was to become status by DACA. I've been on this committee for a period of time where I've introduced over and over again with my colleagues comprehensive immigration reform, which would take everyone who was seeking to become a citizen and put them in a position to access it without fear of deportation. So quickly, when you said you were doing the right thing to a question asked what you would do if you didn't feel well and you had to take, in light of COVID-19, what did you say you would do? You would stay in and not work? Is that what you said you would do?
Yes, we would have to essentially try to ration out whatever we have as in money, food, so that we can survive and be able to go back to work when it's safe.
And were you paid when you were homesick? Even if you had, were you paid by the employer, the farmer, when you were home, when you took the time so that others would not be sick?
There is only a certain days that you get for like sick days, but there's only 3 days, and you have to accumulate them over a certain amount of hours, and it's really hard to get those hours.
So it's 3 days. So, and Mr. Reyes in his capacity could be considered an essential worker. Essential workers bring the food supply from farm to market. They also clean and sanitize public spaces and care for our children. They tend to be elderly sometimes, but Mr. Reyes is a young person. They play an increasingly larger role in the health care of our nation. The COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted our essential workers. Now, according to a recent study, 19.8 million immigrants are now considered essential workers, and they are unstatus. So let me ask the question to our Ms. Yoon and Ms. Jowitz, and if you would take turns because of my time, you can answer that. Here we are trying to confront the disparate impact not only on immigrant workers, but Latinx and African Americans who have had a disparate impact of COVID-19. All of them have been on the front lines in many different ways. Tell us how devastating it is to have such discriminatory practices because someone here time off, and would you not, you're not doctors, but because of our skewed immigration system, meaning that we are not giving people the opportunity for asylum or access to citizenship, even if undocumented, how we are harming our whole society economically and health-wise. Ms. Yoon, would you comment? And then Mr. Jowitz. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to share a story that we heard from a home care worker in Texas in early part of our pandemic, where at that point, this was in March or in early April, where the state was only providing PPE to doctors and nurses in the hospitals. And she was a home care worker. She was going to work caring for an elderly person. And she just was heartbroken because she absolutely wanted to go and care for this home care work for the patient, because for those most vulnerable to the virus, older Americans and those with chronic illnesses and disabilities, home care workers have been the only lifeline to the outside world, providing the care and services they need with daily activities like bathing and eating. But she didn't have a mask, right? And so that's the challenge that I think that our workers are facing as essential workers, is that it was really, she was heartbroken because she didn't know what to do, right? She wanted to go, but she also wanted to protect the patient she was providing support to.
Thank you, Mr. Javits.
Thanks so much. And yeah, I mean, I think we have to think about our workforce, and I think this most clearly with the domestic workforce that Hae-Young has talked about, as kind of like infrastructure. I mean, they're like roads, they're like power lines. They're human social infrastructure upon which strong communities, strong families, a strong economy is built. And if we're not taking care of that economy, that workforce, the entire thing crumbles. I look at the idea about how starting in January, without a doubt, we're going to have a national recovery package that looks at these twin crises we're facing, the public health crisis and the economic devastation that has resulted from the failure to actually control this virus. And I think if we don't reckon with the fact that there are millions upon millions of people who are playing critical roles in protecting the country and serving these jobs that are keeping us going, if we don't remove the legal stigma essentially of being undocumented from these folks and think that we're going to somehow build back in a more resilient and stable way than we were beforehand, we're fooling ourselves.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the time. I yield back.
Thank you very much. And the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman, and I appreciate your holding this hearing. My district is at least 10% foreign-born, so we have a lot of immigrants, both documented and not documented, in my district, and the pandemic has certainly hit them hard. I just wanted to focus on a couple issues here. First off, back in April, or under the CARES Act, Congress authorized one-time stimulus payments of $1,200 per person with additional $500 bumps for children. But there was a big section of folks, I think it was 1.2 million families were unable to receive those stimulus because one member of the household was not a citizen. Didn't matter if that married couple had followed the rules and that the husband or wife had a green card. Is that correct, Mr. Rawitz?
So not the question. So basically, both people on a joint, both heads of the household, if you're filing together on a joint tax form, had to have Social Security numbers, essentially. So if one person filing a joint tax form had a Social Security number, but somebody else had an ITIN that they were filing with, that entire family was disqualified, and that would include the U.S. citizen Social Security number holder who was filing, as well as any children.
So if you had a husband and wife, that would be $2,400 that family didn't get, and if they had 4 kids, that's another $2,000. And we're talking by definition here about a family that's filing a tax return and paying taxes and playing by the rules, right?
Definitionally, they're filing their return. And again, so if you have a U.S. citizen married to an undocumented spouse who have 2 children who are U.S. citizens, that entire family is cut out from getting relief.
Okay, and some of those people could be in process trying to seek asylum or something else. They just haven't gotten through the process yet.
They certainly could be. I mean, if you've got a Social Security number, then that would be the cure to the issue. But again, we know that there are millions of undocumented immigrants in the country who are contributing, who do every year faithfully file tax forms, and they use an ITIN just like the federal government allows them to use.
Right, so they're not cheating the system here.
No, these are folks who are net contributors to the country. They've long been net contributors to the country, and there's basically unified agreement among economists.
Okay. Ms. Yoon, I see that your organization has a chapter in Philadelphia, and I represent part of Philadelphia. Do you have any particular stories with regard to the Philadelphia area, or can I follow up with you about that?
I'm happy to follow up with you. We have a very robust chapter in Philly, so happy to follow up with your office.
I would appreciate that. I mean, much of your testimony really resonated. Pennsylvania has an aging population, and so when we think of essential workers, you know, we think of doctors and nurses and such, but we've got so many folks who rely upon home care, care for the disabled, folks in assisted living, folks in senior centers. You mentioned the growing need for care workers, particularly in elder care. Can you elaborate on this and talk about the outsized role that immigrants now play in caring for our aging population?
Yes. So as I've noted in my testimony, that from 2016 into 2060, the population of adults aged 65 or older in the country will nearly double from 49.2 million to over 90 million people. And the number of adults aged 85 or older is expected to nearly triple over the same period to 19 million. The aging of our nation means the aging of our workforce, means more workers will be retiring and leaving their workforce. And as advances in technology and healthcare allows all of us to live longer, it is so important that all of us live in our homes, amongst our family, amongst our community, and that we're going to need, as a nation, care workers who's going to provide them very basic needs, like helping to get up in the morning, helping to bathe, helping to take medication, right? These are critical components of allowing our aging populations to live and thrive in their homes and community.
Thank you, Mr.
Can I add really quickly one thing, Congressman? And to Hayoung's point, over this current decade alone, the National Academy of Sciences found that but for immigrants and their children, we would actually lose 7 million people from the working age population of this country. So if we think that immigrants are playing an essential role today, just wait over the next 10 and 20 years.
Okay, thank you. I see my time has expired.
The lady's time has expired. I have waited to the end so I could make sure that all the members had a chance to ask questions given the votes. But given that the votes are over in the House for today, there's an interest among members in the second round of questions. So I will begin my first round questions, and then we will start again for those members who are able to stay with our second round. I'll just say, Mr. Reyes, it was interesting to listen to you. Your parents have lived each day with the fear that they could be picked up by ICE and separated from each other at any time. Last year, House of Representatives passed a bill called the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. And in addition to many reforms relative to the H-2A program, it would have allowed farm workers like you and your parents to get what's called a blue card, which would allow you to work legally in the United States. And then after a period of time, give you the option to either renew the blue card or apply for legal permanent residence. If that became law, how would that change your life and the life of your family?
Thank you, Chairwoman Lofgren, so much for your leadership and important work in the farm work legalization. For me personally, it would broaden my horizon of education, career-wise, and I would be able to not just apply for a minimum wage job, but I can now apply to a dream job, such as like working at NASA or for any federal job that there is, as that is my personal goal, to work for NASA as a robotics engineer. And for my family, it would be such a great relief that they can now work in peace. And I'm pretty sure that would be true for all the undocumented farm workers, that they can now work at the job more peacefully, more safer, they would be able to claim the rights that they deserve. As right now, they are afraid to claim rights because they're undocumented, and the ones that are in charge know that and violate the rights of those workers. So I think with the legalization, it would let them open up about what's actually going on.
You know, it's interesting. My husband grew up in Bakersfield, and when as a young man, his father was constantly pressing him to take jobs in the summer. And one summer, his father insisted that he take a job picking carrots. And so he went out into the field to pick carrots, and he spent the whole day picking carrots and earned about $1. Meanwhile, farm workers who knew how to pick carrots had picked, 5 times, 10 times as much as he picked. Because although being a farm worker does not require a college education, it is not unskilled. You can't, what he found out is you can't just walk in and pick enough carrots to actually produce anything if you don't know what the heck you're doing, which he did not. He didn't last. He was an unsuccessful farm worker. So to think that these are jobs that are going to be easily filled is not correct. And I'll just say, in addition to chairing the subcommittee, I used to be an immigration lawyer, and I used to teach immigration law. And we have not really updated our immigration laws. It's the same basic structure that was done in 1965. And the system really isn't serving America well right now. I was interested to hear your wonderful story, Ms. Navrati, Reedy, becoming a U.S. citizen, and how wonderful that was. But it started me thinking about the MDs who we need. We need these MDs and scientists. But the way we've structured the law is if a scientist who is doing cutting edge research on COVID-19 was born in India, she can't get a visa. But if she was born in Germany, she could. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So we've structured this in a way that it really doesn't serve America. It does not serve America because we've got essential workers all the way from people who are keeping food in the supermarket so we can eat, or doing science research, or helping sick people because they're physicians. And the way the law is written, there's no, in many cases, no way for people to legalize their status, to do what you did, and I'm so glad you did, to become an American like us. And so we need to take a look at how we craft the law so it works for the United States, works for our people, works for our country. And with that, I think that my time has expired. And so we'll go for our second round of questions. And I would turn first to the ranking member, Mr. Buck, for his question.
I have nothing at this time. Thank you, Chairwoman.
All right. I don't know, is Pramila still on this call? If not, I know Mr. Correa is interested, and if Pramila returns, we will recognize her.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for indulging me. I do have a couple of questions, thoughts. I'll start out, Mr. Jowitz, if I can. If a farm worker, nurse, or poultry worker wants a work permit, can they actually leave the country, return to their country of origin, and apply for a work permit and return to the U.S.? I want to be clear because I have a lot of casework, immigration casework in my office. And as far as I know, there is no real pathway to get a work permit or a green card to this country right now. Can you clarify for me what the state of the law is?
Yeah, would that it were so simple. I mean, first of all, any person who has accrued a year of unlawful presence in this country, and again, remember that I said that the average undocumented immigrant of the 10.5 million who have been here for 14 years on average. If you've accrued 1 year of unlawful presence, the second you leave the country, you're barred for 10 years from coming back. And so this idea that you could step foot abroad and magically come back the right way doesn't make any sense. Moreover, even if you somehow got that waived and you didn't have that, there aren't a lot of pathways that you can actually apply for in an embassy abroad. that would then allow you to come back, right? So if you look at farm workers, for instance, or any sort of like of the other worker category in immigration law, you're looking at 5,000 or 10,000 immigrant visas available per year. People who are applying for those.
So let me ask you, if somebody is in another country, India, Mexico, China, Vietnam, where most of our immigrants are coming from, haven't stepped in the U.S., can I go to the American Embassy in Mexico City and apply to come to the U.S. and automatically get a permit to come to the U.S. to work?
I mean, definitely not automatically, certainly. I mean, there are different pathways you could try and choose. And so you could try and access the H-2A program. You could try to access the H-2B program. There are certain pathways that are available, but they are so inadequate and so poorly tailored to the realistic wants and needs of this country that, ultimately the dysfunction of the system is fundamentally responsible for the dysfunction we see in the country today.
I just want to make sure I'm being clear here. If I tell my constituents, taxpayers in my district, you can leave the country and apply for a permit, then come back, that's actually not correct.
No, that is dangerous advice to offer them. There's one thing that was.
Thank you go ahead. Thank you very much. Let me move on to Ms. Nefertel, if I can. You mentioned that you married an American citizen. Did you meet your spouse in your country of origin, or did you meet he in the U.S.?
In the U.S., sir.
Were you here as a student, or did you have a permit to be in the U.S. when you met him?
I was on a tourist visa.
A tourist visa. You didn't happen to overstay on that tourist visa, did you?
No, sir, I did not.
So I guess, Chairwoman Lofgren just said that, and I agree with her, we have these cutting edge scientists in terms of technology that this country needs to stay ahead of the rest of the international competition, and they can't stay. So what would you advise those students studying in the U.S., doing all this postdoctoral research? Should they get married to an American citizen to stay in the U.S., or what other way can they stay in the U.S.? That's a question, ma'am. Mr. Fattah, what would you recommend to these hardworking individuals that are busting really hard, trying to find the American dream like you did? What would you ask, what advice would you give those people to find the American dream like you did?
I'm not in a position to give an advice like that.
Most people aren't, but what would you tell them? Any advice? Find an American and marry them?
No, sir.
But you did it. That's the way you did it. You wouldn't advise them to do that.
That was my story.
Thank you. Madam Chairperson, I have a few seconds left, but I yield the remainder of my time. Thank you very much.
The gentleman yields back, and I know Ms. Jackson Lee has a question, but before I recognize Ms. Jackson Lee, I would just note, certainly Ms. Navratil has made it clear that she's not comfortable giving legal advice. That's not her expertise, and we respect that. But certainly getting married only to get a visa would not be proper. That you have to have a real marriage, a valid marriage, and to meet the requirements of the immigration law. And I think we don't want to leave any confusion on that point. And obviously, Ms. Navratil met, the man of her dreams and a valid marriage. And so at this point, Ms. Jackson Lee, I guess, has stepped out. So I will call on Ms. Scanlon. And if Ms. Jackson Lee returns, we will hear from her. Ms. Scanlon, you're recognized.
I don't have further questions. Thank you.
All right. And is Ms. Jackson Lee available? Seeing not, then I will just conclude with one further set of questions. Mr. Jawitz, you have indicated that the country has a great dependence on people who are lawfully, they're here under color of law. They're DACA recipients, they're TPS recipients. Are you able to provide a breakdown of how many DACA recipients or TPS recipients are fit within the essential worker category that the Department of Homeland Security has issued. Is there any way to know that?
So not directly, but what we can do and what a small number of research institutions do is look at the American Community Survey and make imputations essentially about immigration status that can identify these folks in the data. And what we found in looking for this hearing at the new CISA version 4.0 of essential workers, there are actually about 331,000 DACA recipients and about 219,000 TPS holders who are in these essential occupations. And we're talking about tens of thousands in healthcare jobs who are supporting the healthcare industry, talking about a very large share actually who are working in food-related occupations. And if you look at the TPS workforce, for instance, very, very substantially related to doing home health work and other sort of assistant work in the medical profession, nursing assistants and the like.
All right. So I think at this point, that was my last question. I think there are no further members in line to ask questions. And unless I hear from them and prove that I'm incorrect, it would be time to draw a hearing to a close. So we'll conclude. I want to thank the witnesses. Really, it's been fabulous to hear from each one of you. We do appreciate it. And without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional questions for the witnesses or additional material for the record. And without objection, this hearing is now adjourned. Thank you very much.